Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Stev Leibowitz. It's the eve of the anniversary of the World Trade Center bombing of 2001. Those of us who are old enough remember that horrific terror attack 21 years ago. That's when 4 coordinated Islamic suicide attacks were carried out by Al-Qaeda in 4 coordinated plane hijackings, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center buildings, another into the Pentagon, and then fighting off passengers before crashing the 4th with all passengers aboard. Nearly 3,000 people died. We also remember the response to the attacks. The United States and its allies waged a multi-decade-long global war on terror. First, it went after the Afghanistan-based Taliban, conquered the entire country, and eventually, 10 years later, in 2011, found and killed its leader, Osama bin Laden, in Pakistan. Continuing the 9/11 response, the U.S. and allies fought and defeated Saddam Hussein and forced regime change in Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. According to public information, some 300,000 civilians have been killed during the 23-year-old U.S. response. 11 months ago, Israel went to war against Hamas after its surprise attack murdered 1,300 Israelis on October 7th, the worst attack in Israeli history. Not years, but 340 days later, Israel is still fighting Hamas in Gaza. But unlike the case with the U.S. and its allies, the world does not have patience or understanding for Israel's response. Well, I'm joined now to discuss by Dr. Gerald Steinberg, a political scientist and U.S. strategic affairs expert and head of NGO Monitor. And from London, even though we met just last week in Jerusalem, is British military expert and retired Major Andrew Fox. Thank you guys both for being with me. Andrew, let me start with you. The U.S. suffered a surprise attack. It went after its enemy, a terror group based in Afghanistan. They forced regime change in order to end Taliban rule and its support for Al-Qaeda. Israel is fighting on our own border against an enemy that actually ruled Gaza, and we're being warned by the U.S. and Britain not to follow their example and don't harm civilians. It's kind of ironic, no?
The critical difference here is that in 2001, the US did not have a global, heavily funded media and disinformation campaign that was thrown at them relentlessly for the entire duration of the war. And that's really what separates us here. And if you look at even things like lawfare and being taken to the ICJ, threats of arrest warrants in the ICC, none of that came America or indeed the wider NATO coalition's way for any of it. Potentially because they have, UN Security Council permanent places, but perhaps because the other side weren't ready at that stage and they hadn't worked out the way to leverage this new thing that was in 2001 called the internet, where people were learning how to communicate in real time in the way we do en masse today. But that's the key difference for me. It's the massive disinformation campaign that's been fired against Israel as another round in this war.
Gerald, could Israel somehow have built a stronger coalition that would stick with us as we carry out the destruction of Hamas?
Yeah, there's some important differences. I don't think that Israel was in a position to build a coalition. The closest we have is this relationship with the United States, which at times is tenuous, but tends to be quite strong, even though there are differences of opinion throughout this time. But let's remember, we're talking about a campaign. It's basically to erase Israel from the map. Palestinians have never sat down seriously with Israel to work out a two-state solution. The goal has always been the elimination of Israel, rejectionism, the whole concept of Palestinians as being permanent refugees, all the alliances they have through the UN, through UNRWA, through the European Union, all of those things, and of course the NGO world, which I've been tracking for close now to 22 years. These are all on the other side, against any kind of Israeli ability to defend its citizens against the type of attack that we've seen on October 7th. So building a coalition like the United States had in Iraq, despite all the claims and allegations of massive casualties. I think you used the number 300,000 in your introduction, Steve. And all those numbers are always very questionable. Where do they come from? Who makes that analysis? Because there are many, many claims of collateral damage, of innocent people being killed in large numbers. We even saw it today, lots of claims of large-scale Palestinian casualties when Israel did another precise attack against three highly important, high-level remaining Hamas commanders, and the first thing that was said and repeated in the media was large-scale civilian casualties, and then you get into the whole issue of war crimes. So Israel's very much isolated. Andrew talks about the massive disinformation campaign. That's part of the reality. When you have that reality, building a coalition is extremely difficult to do.
So let's try, Andrew, I want to come back to you, and I want to try to get through that disinformation. You're a lecturer at the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst. You've visited Israel 3 times since the start of the war. You met Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant. In your opinion, how is the war going?
Well, which war is the first question?
Let's start with Gaza. Gaza war.
So Gaza, I think, is going pretty well, actually. If you look at the war aims there to dismantle Hamas, to secure Israel's border and to return the hostages, there is progress on all of those fronts. Now, some of the hostages have been returned, unfortunately, posthumously, which is clearly not what anyone wants, but it is a reality of what happens when hostages are taken, unfortunately, and Hamas are firmly to blame for everything that's happened to those poor people. In terms of defeating and dismantling Hamas, the tunnels is the key here. The tunnels are everything. They are the single most strategic center of gravity that there exists in Gaza. If the tunnels are dismantled, Hamas are forced to the surface and they can be struck, which is what we saw overnight last night with the strike in the humanitarian area, which took out a Hamas command and control node, which seems to have been some very senior commanders as well. In terms of securing Israel's borders, we've seen a massive reduction in rocket strikes, rocket launches from Gaza. There's a buffer zone now established around the entire perimeter of the Gaza Strip, and Israel controls the Philadelphia corridor. So that's going pretty well as well. So,
Andrew, could I interrupt just for a second?
Yeah.
I just wanted to interrupt just for a second and ask, in your opinion, how much longer do we need to mainly focus on Gaza before we can turn our attentions to the north? Our political leaders are saying that's where the balance of force will soon be needed, if not right now already.
Yeah, I think the counterpoint to that argument is that the closest crocodile to the canoe, as it were, is Gaza because of the geographical proximity to the major conurbations of Israel. The IDF soldiers I've spoken to, and I've spoken to Commanders, Southern Command, both divisional commanders from Gaza, the rough estimate they've given me is it was 12 to 18 months a month ago, so 11 to 17 months more to complete that task. And I don't think we can underestimate just how huge that tunnel network is. It's a source of intense frustration to me that the IDF won't release to me the maps they've shown me of the network they've mapped so far, because it's incredible. It looks like an entire spider's web along the whole of Gaza. And to take those tunnels apart is going to take a huge amount of time. And, that depends on whether Israel has the strategic resilience to manage that task whilst dealing with what's happening in the north.
All right, Dr. Steinberg, let me turn to you. In this post-Afghanistan period, is the U.S. overly gun-shy over confrontations that require boots on the ground?
To a significant degree, yes, at least the U.S. under the current administration, but I think also even a Republican administration, the isolationism, the language we often hear that the United States is tired of being the world's policeman. And the problem is there that if the United States is not going to lead on these kinds of issues, not just, we're talking about the front with Gaza, then we have the Hezbollah Iran front, Hezbollah specifically, and the threats which are not comparable in any way to what the United States had to deal with in Afghanistan or Iraq. They didn't have at least 100,000 rockets being aimed at their homeland, at their capital city, at their civilians, and that's something very serious that's different. And the international community, the UN, that was supposed to prevent Hezbollah, according to the agreement of 2006, to be able to mass those forces to attack Israel, totally totally neglected its job. They totally failed, and therefore they have no right when the so-called foreign minister, the head of foreign policy of the European Union, Joseph Borrell, criticizes, condemns Israeli responses. He's one of the main people responsible for not implementing the promises of security based on the 2006 ceasefire agreement in Lebanon with Hezbollah. Then we have the front with Houthim and the Red Sea, which are also, that's another threat that exists. So there are a lot of differences between the case of Afghanistan and the United States. In the case of dealing with the Red Sea threat, they're simply defending. They're not attacking the infrastructure that allows the Houthi forces to prevent shipping through the Red Sea, and therefore there's no shipping. And it's been that way for, I guess, most of the last 10 months. So the failure of the United States to lead, to take what should be its role as maybe the term world's policeman, they want to have a coalition of the willing, but they're not building a coalition. They ran away from Afghanistan. They basically ended their presence almost in Iraq and Syria. And that has very extreme consequences for Israeli security and for the interests of the Western world completely.
Andrew, Britain is now refusing licenses for weapon sales of items needed by the IDF in Gaza. This from a nation that sailed across the world to fight a war in the Falklands. Are the Brits going soft?
100%. Yeah, the new Labour government, since they got in power, have had a relentless drumbeat of anti-Israeli sentiment, starting with withdrawing the UK's amicus curiae in support of Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gallant, moving on to our Foreign Secretary going on a tour of the Middle East, trying to persuade Israel to cease fire immediately, and now followed by this latest debacle, I think is the word I would choose. And unfortunately, domestic politics always come into foreign affairs. And Labour lost 4 seats, I think it was, maybe 5, to pro-Gaza parties in the last election. So they were elected on a specifically pro-Gaza ticket. And they now sit in the House of Commons for the next 5 years. And Labour is, I think, see this as a way of shoring up that left-wing, slightly more Muslim extremist vote ready for the next election. And I think it's really telling that the only licenses they've suspended is 30 out of 350. They have done the bare minimum that they possibly could get away with and not cause a huge international incident. And so that shows not only a cowardice not to support their convictions, but also it demonstrates just how absolutely token this gesture is.
Gerald, I want to have time just to touch a little bit on the U.S. political scene. They have a big debate, a presidential debate tonight in a very close election. But from what I can tell, on the left side of the political spectrum, there's a reluctance to engage and a criticism of Israel and a kind of a pro-Palestinian sentiment. And on the right, there's a growing isolationism. If push comes to shove, will the U.S. be a strong ally of Israel and stand up in front of these multi-front challenges in years to come?
I'm going to be careful with predictions and crystal balls. They'll never work. But I will make a distinction between the political and the military aspects of this. We've had very high-level military officials from the United States almost continuously in and out of Israel. I think the head of CENTCOM just left today. He used to hear back and forth, and many other high-level military officials. The U.S. did dispatch large military forces, particularly naval forces, to act as hopefully a deterrent against Iran and against the Houthi attacks, with perhaps some success, perhaps not. But on the other hand, I think and that's a disconnect with the words that we're hearing from the politicians. Kamala Harris is constantly asked, and she asked about support for Israel. She says, yes, we are absolutely, totally committed to Israel defense, but she won't say if she becomes president, under her administration, the United States will provide all the weapons necessary for Israel to defeat its enemies on all the different fronts. She's been very careful for the same reasons that Andrew talked about in the UK. There are a number of House seats that are supportive of the Palestinian position, and the Democrats have been afraid to really confront that. So I think that there really are no guarantees, and Israel has to take that into account. while hoping that the United States will continue to provide support.
So I wanted to ask Andrew the same question about Britain. Will the British wake up and confront Islamic terror threats on all of its fronts, especially against Iran?
I think we need to disambiguate some of the issues here. So Iran is a slightly different issue from a UK perspective to domestic Islamist terrorism. They're two slightly different things, albeit there is a connection if Iranian money is coming the way of certain agitators. I think our security services are fully all over the threat, and we've had a number of attempted attacks prevented and stopped. And things like 7th bombing in London and the Ariana Grande concert bombing in Manchester have certainly given us enough of a focus to make sure that the UK is switched on to this. But I think in terms of understanding the wider Middle Eastern picture and the desperate need to confront Iran and be significantly more aggressive with them than we have been up till now, I don't think this government are the ones who will take significant or decisive steps in that regard.
Gerald, the Islamic terrorists are still out there, and so are the threats from Iran and its proxies. Has the West managed to defeat the threat that attacked on 9/11, or are they going to wake up to another 9/11 sooner or later?
In a certain sense, again, I'm going to be very careful, but in a significant sense, it's now been 23 years since 9/11. It's also been, I don't remember exactly how many years, but at least I think 20 years since the bombings in the Britain, the 7/7 bombings in London and other aspects like that. A lot of terrorist attacks, as Andrew mentioned, have been foiled, have been intercepted before. We don't know what we don't know, but there are many that we do know about. Iranian attacks against Israeli targets throughout Europe and other places have been stopped, also in Asia and Thailand and elsewhere. So one can be optimistic. That's the best I think you can do, is be optimistic that there is a wake-up going on, has been going on for the last 20-plus years. The intelligence services are much better, much more aware, and much more active in preempting, in monitoring. But also, I think the threat has grown significantly. There are a lot more people involved, a lot more radicalization. And all the demonstrations, that's a very mild term, the protests, the violence, the intimidation that we see under the flag of the Palestinian cause going on in the US, in the UK, in Canada, in Australia, and elsewhere, also creates a potential for more people, more individuals, more groups to carry out these attacks. So I think it remains open as to how successful the West is going to be. But there is greater awareness. Even in Germany now, they want to be more careful in screening people who come into their borders. And I think that's the first step, and also preventing the more radical voices from being able to act independently. There's a greater awareness of that, but it's been slow, and I think it's been limited. Needs to be expanded.
Major Fox, are the Allies prepared to make the sacrifice needed? We're talking about financial. We're talking about the lives of soldiers. Are they able to take the fight against jihad, to take the offensive in that war?
It's a difficult one to answer because we don't know what that war is going to look like, where it's going to be, or when. And you know, if we're talking about preparation, are we talking about military preparedness, or are we talking about domestic state security and policing services being prepared? I mean, this is a huge, broad span of a question.
Let me ask more specifically, if I could. Specifically, there are a lot of protests in countries like in Britain. Will the political will be able to overcome the severe criticism that's coming against countries like Israel when they try to fight Islamic terror?
Okay, so this war gives us a great model for what we can expect should that future war with our own forces come. We know that the cause for war is going to be attacked. You see that all the time in regards to Israel, as people try to diminish or downplay 7th of October as if it isn't sufficient casus belli, you know, the reason for going to war. We know that the actions during the war are going to be attacked, and we know we're going to be exposed to huge amounts of footage that's going to be taken and misrepresented, and a propaganda storm of dead children and dead civilians presented to the world as if it's completely illegal, the actions that are being taken. So we also know that we're probably going to get lawfare as well. So we can expect cases being brought against people in the ICJ or the ICC. And so the lesson to learn for the West at this stage is how on earth are we going to counter that in an era where everyone has a mobile phone, everyone can take video, and everyone can upload stuff instantaneously, well before we can get our own messages out. So it's going to be really, really tricky, and I think that's the thing we should be focusing on preparing for.
Well, I wish we had more time. Both guests fascinating to me, but it's all the time we have this evening. Thank you to our guests, Dr. Gerald Steinberg from Jerusalem and from London and from his sickbed, Major Andrew Fox. Thank you so much for being with us today. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at ILTV.tv. Thanks for watching. Let's win the war and bring them home alive.